Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back to another bonus episode. As I mentioned last week, each Wednesday in August, I will be releasing extra episodes of Civics and Coffee to celebrate our 4 years together. If you listened to the conversation with Ethan last week, then you also heard me say I'm planning a major announcement at the end of the month for the Civics and Coffee universe. So be sure to mark your calendars for August 28th, where I will share the news. I am so excited and cannot wait to spill the beans. For this week's extra episode, I welcomed historian and educator Kristin Kessinger. Kessinger recently earned her master's degree in history and specializes in slavery and the Civil War, and when she's not studying history in the archives, loves to spend time with her 3 boys and being outdoors. She shared some of her scholarship with me that I thought was incredibly fascinating, so I invited her on to have a conversation about her work and the importance of history. We recorded our interview over Zoom, so I am inserting my standard audio quality warning here. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hey everyone, joining me today is Kristin Kessinger. She is an educator and historian who recently completed her master's degree in U.S. and World History at Missouri State University. She is here to chat about her research, history, and everything in between. Welcome, Kristin.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming on and being willing to talk about your research. But before we dive in, please tell us a little bit about yourself. So what got you interested in history and what made you decide to pursue a graduate degree?
Well, first, a little bit about me. I have 3 boys. They're 14, 12, and 9, so they're pretty wild. So the household is pretty raucous a lot of the time. I love traveling. I love being outside. Camping and fire pits are my favorite thing. Roasting marshmallows, that type of thing. Love going to the beach. I love spending time with my friends and laughing and playing board games and being ridiculous. Just stuff like that. As far as history goes, when I was a child, there's a place called Dot Mill on the White River where we used to float and go on float trips. And I used to think a lot about how the mill operated, and I would ask my dad a lot of questions about that. And so I got really interested in how they ground flour and how they would come from Arkansas to this mill to use the cotton gin and all of that stuff. And so that kind of got me started when I was very, very young and interested. And then we have a theme park called Silver Dollar City that is next to the city that I'm from, and it's set in the 1880s, and I always loved going there and watching the blacksmith demonstrations, and I think that's kind of what started it. And then I had a grandfather that was in the Civil War, and he was injured at the Battle of Cedar Creek.
Oh, wow.
And it left him permanently disabled. And he basically had to, live the rest of the days on his farm, like crawling through the fields and working and instead of providing for his family the way that he wanted to. So that was kind of another thing that kind of got me started. But once I started college, I took my first history course and I was hooked. I've always been interested in history, but college made me kind of fall in love with it. I knew I wanted to work in this field for the rest of my life. When I got a job at the history department as a tutor when I was an undergrad, and I fell in love with teaching and working with students. And one of the best feelings in the world is when I became a teaching assistant and got to watch my students improve and watch their progress. So.
Wonderful. And I'm curious about your grandfather. How did you discover his service? Did your family keep all of his pension records and that kind of stuff?
My aunt and my grandmother did a lot of research on him. Like I said, his grandfather had migrated from, I believe, Virginia, and and that's where he served in the Civil War, and then they ended up in Missouri. I'm a sixth generation Missourian because his family ended up migrating to Missouri, and
Wow.
so they found all of his pension records, and they found out how he was injured in the war, and how how he got shelled in the lower calf is where it hit him, and so like I said earlier, he couldn't really walk, and
Right.
so they knew that he had a case of gangrene.
Mm.
That's another thing that was really interesting because there was one of the documents that the doctor said that he had the constitution of a horse. They couldn't believe how he survived this shelling and the gangrene episode. And so, yeah, it's pretty cool.
Awesome. Yeah, I know my grandfather served in World War II, but number one, he has a very common name, William Davis, and number two, he was a sharecropper. He was born into a family of sharecroppers, and so they didn't exactly know when his date of birth was. So tracking down his service records is has thus far proved pretty fruitless. So I'm always envious of people that are like, yes, my grandfather did this. I was able to find his records. I'm like, I want to do that too.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool as a kid. And when they found more information, especially about his pension, because we didn't know, because getting a pension was so difficult
Yeah.
for a lot of ex-soldiers who were wounded in the war. Even, Union soldiers had a hard time
Yeah,
getting
definitely.
a pension. So,
Okay, so sorry for that rabbit hole I just did. That was so great. And so, what made you decide to pursue a graduate degree?
I like I said, I kind of wanted to teach. That tutoring job as an undergrad really got me interested in working with students and helping people learn how to write better. And I'm not the world's best writer for sure, but I absolutely love helping people improve their voice, and that way they can give the world something unique. And I think that a lot of people have a lot to say on paper, but they don't, and especially people who don't want to speak, they have a lot to say and they have a lot to contribute to society, but writing gives them that voice. And so if you can teach somebody to write, then they have that historical record, and they can contribute and utilize existing historical records meaningfully to change society, and that means a lot to me. And so giving people that opportunity is really important to me.
Wonderful. And so, what was your area of focus? I know you've got did you just graduate with U.S. and World History? So
Yeah.
how did you streamline that focus?
I I didn't streamline it very well, to be honest. I have a hard time streamlining anything. But I did settle on U.S. Civil War and slavery. I do a lot of work in enslavement, obviously, which is what we're talking about today with my research. But I also did some really interesting work in world history with imagery in early modern Europe during
Mm,
the witchcraft trials, and so the early modern witch hunts era. And so I got to do my junior seminar project on that, and I really, really enjoyed early modern European history as well. So,
and you shared a piece of scholarship with me that like I said before we started recording, I thought it was wonderful, incredibly fascinating, and it really focuses on the interplay of religion and paternalism in the state of Missouri. So, how'd you come across this as a topic?
well, there was kind of a combination of factors there. I was familiar with Diane Moody Burke's work on slavery in the state, as well as Christopher Phillips' work on border states and the Western identity in the antebellum period during the war. And so I started doing this writing project for my graduate degree, and I ran across an article by Christopher Luce called Slavery's Champions Stood at Odds, Polygenesis and the Defense of Slavery. And he illuminates a conflict between Southern pro slavery Christians who are paternalistically justifying slavery by means of biblical hierarchy instead of race. And then this argument they had with ethnologists who justified hierarchy based on solely what they felt was scientific proof of Black inferiority. So, this large portion of Southern pro slavery Christians believed strictly in monogenism, which all races in their eyes came from Adam. So one source. And then ethnologists embrace this polygenism, which espouses the idea that white and Black people came from separate origins and genomes. And so that argument really fascinated me. And I had heard of another theory, a Southern theory called the curse of Ham theory, where, they state that the Black race descended from Ham, who was cursed after witnessing his father's nakedness, his father being Noah, and kind of encompasses both that biblical hierarchy idea and this racial difference as a justification for enslavement. So those are like three of the main paternalistic justification sources that were coming out of the South. But with Missouri's unique stance on unionism and slavery, I kind of wondered how those ideas migrated into Missouri and how citizens received them as they were, pushing towards statehood and the debate on slavery towards statehood, the Missouri Compromise. And then, as we moved into the era with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so, I began to wonder in that antebellum period how the existence of scientific racism in Missouri affected citizens, or if they even knew about it, because, obviously in rural areas, which was largely the largest portion of Missouri was rural at the time. And so I didn't know how far from the city center, if that was something like in St. Louis, I found evidence of scientific racism that had come from the South. But I had no idea, what extent or I had no idea what the extent of that influence was.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering about that. And then, if it was something that was incorporated into religious rhetoric at the time, because academia and religion are so interconnected, they're inextricable, basically. And so, so anything that was in academia at the time being, scientific racism, it was going to meld with paternalistic ideology of slavery and the hierarchical biblical realm as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, you touched on this a little bit before, but you mentioned that Missouri had kind of a unique concept of slavery. So what was that, and how did it emerge?
Yeah, so Diane Moody Burke has done extensive foundational work to this research regarding enslavement in Missouri. And On Slavery's Border talks about a lack of competition from the planter elite and how it allowed small-scale slavery to thrive in Missouri. And so the population increased in Missouri considerably by 1820, or between 1820 and 1860, rather. The majority of households in Missouri kept fewer than 50 people in bondage. And that's what historians normally define as small-scale slaveholding. And so although Missouri slavers nurtured this reputation for conducting this milder form of slavery, sources kind of point to a more complicated reality. So Missourians thought that because they were not a big part of the Southern planter elite and that they didn't overtly abuse their enslaved people rather, that they were more benevolent.
Mm-hmm.
And they wanted to maintain this benevolent reputation and in order to encourage migration into the region. But in reality, violent interactions still occurred between enslavers and those they kept in bondage. And so, although the systems of enslavement didn't maintain the same structure as the Southern planter elites, these small-scale environments often presented this opportunity for personal closeness
Mm-hmm.
that exacerbated viciousness and punishments and manipulations on an individual level. And so Burke's argument is basically that even though we didn't have the same model of slavery in Missouri, it was still very damaging and insidious.
And how did Missouri's status as a border state to help influence the paternalism you discuss?
Yeah, so Christopher Phillips does a lot of really great work on that. So he kind of demonstrates how Missouri encompassed unparalleled complexity due to its unique position as a Western border state in the Union. He argues that Missouri's identity as a border state meant that citizens embodied this mix of Northern ideology, which encompassed, free labor and a pro-union stance, and then Southern ideology, which often supported a pro-slavery conditional unionist stance. And so alongside this challenge of the North and South kind of coming together and in Missouri, there was also this promise of forming a new political philosophy in the West that encouraged Missourians to kind of create this disparate identity from Northern and Southerners at the same time. So they had this kind of vision of westward development. And so they embraced political goals related to expansion, such as building infrastructure and kind of less intervention from the government in personal matters and stuff like that. They wanted to kind of keep their private lives and their autonomy and individualism. And so they had a little bit more of an adventurous nature about them. And which makes sense because they migrated to the West to build kind of a new identity, a new way of doing life that they thought was kind of this middle ground between the North and the South. And so there was a lot of complexity going on there between all of these different factions of people who were moving to the same area at the same time. And so what I found is that the theory of Ham and other blends of biblical hierarchy and scientific justifications that took place and developed over time in Missouri kind of show up some of them show up pretty early, but then they kind of develop, like I said, as we go through the Missouri Compromise, and then especially when we get closer to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the debates over slavery come to the forefront. And so basically there was this amalgamation of factors when you consider Missouri's conceptualization of their milder form, quote, quote, milder form of slavery, and these competing ideological and political factors that sort of dictated how they paternalized slavery. So yeah, one of the descriptions that comes up often is how Missourians often tried to find like this modern middle ground between radical and anti-slavery positions. So my research looks into different cases where Missouri academic and religious leaders use these blends of paternalistic justifications, and I also briefly touch kind of on how these ideas affected enslaved Missourians. So.
Well, and kind of speaking of your research and you're kind of pulling in the academic piece and you're pulling in the religious dogma piece, just curious, what challenges did you encounter in kind of putting this together?
Oh, that was really rough. I had decided originally I was going to write a thesis, and then of course having three boys and being in the situation I was in, I needed to get out and work faster. So I was working originally on a thesis idea. And so all of this would have been great if I had all of the room that I would have had if I were writing a thesis. But then I ended up having to kind of compress it down into a seminar paper. And so after having done, extensive research on interviews from the Works Progress Administration on how enslaved people experienced slavery in Missouri specifically, and kind of how these larger ideas also kind of affected the enslaved people that were having these religious experiences in Missouri as well, that added a whole nother thing to trying to compress this into 30 pages when I had originally expected to have, over 100. So yeah, it was a complex and interconnected topic, and there were too many broad things to kind of reasonably fit into the paper. So brevity was obviously a challenge for this particular project, but also as far as the research process goes, it was impossible to do this topic justice with the time restraints of a semester in the archives. I could have spent months and months in the archives, and I still cannot wait to get back there because, it was just lovely sitting down with these 19th century documents and going through, these real life examples that I could, illuminate and bring to life and speak on. And so, yeah, it was really tough to kind of narrow that down, and I still feel so inadequate because I know that there's so many things I could have incorporated that I didn't have the time to. But it was well researched given the time constraints. But it doesn't come close to doing the topic justice. I hope to do that in the future.
Well, and that brings me to my next question, which is, where do you hope to take this research, or where do you hope future scholars take the research?
So I would absolutely like to go more into depth about how different demographics and political affiliations interacted with these Southern paternalistic justifications for slavery and religion. And I was very limited. I spent a lot of time in the Boonslick region because a lot of the ideas that came up from the South came through religious leaders like the second president of the University of Missouri, James Shannon, which again, if I had time to get into it, there's a kind of a microcosm going on at the University of Missouri at the time where, they're struggling with a lot of these slavery debates and issues. And so they, at first they have a person who they hired as the first president of the university, and he wasn't pro-slavery enough. And then they flipped over right around the time that there was a Democratic Party split in the state, and they ended up hiring James Shannon. And so there are these political and academic and religious actors that like James Shannon and Joseph Nash McDowell, who started a college, a medical college in St. Louis. And I would love to have time to dig into more people, because I only got like 3 different religious leaders that I was able to really dig into and incorporate into my research. And there are so many more that I just did not have the time to explore. So there are more demographics to explore. There's more individual actors to explore. And so I just can't wait to get into all of that whenever I have the time.
And with your current paper, have you considered like doing any kind of article submissions to see if anybody will take it up? Because I feel like there's so many journals that focus on Civil War history that this would be perfect.
Yeah, there are. And with with this research being so broad and having to compress so much of it, I have talked to some of my colleagues who have said that, there are definitely multiple journal articles that could come out of this research. It's just having the time to get into the archives and make it a full-bodied presentation. And so a lot of these topics that I used in my paper, as far as individuals, and then especially narratives of enslaved people and how Southern paternalistic justifications for slavery affected them on a personal level, and then how that kind of changed their conceptualization of themselves, moving from an enslaved generation to a free generation. And so how that kind of took time to develop their own kind of autonomy outside of what they've been told that they were, as inferior members of society who were subjugated for centuries. And so, like, there's a lot of research that can be done on how that affected enslaved people in generations to come. And so I would also like to kind of look into that.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that I found just so impressive in the piece that I read was with the interviews of the enslaved individuals during the Work Progress Administration, right? Like, these were people who were very aware that they were being interviewed by white folks about slavery, right? So they were
Yes.
very careful in what they
Yes.
said and how they talked about slavery. But I still think you teased out kind of the long-term impacts of the paternalism of this ideology. And I just thought it was very, very well done. So
Oh, thank you so much. I worked really hard on that because, one of one of the main considerations that I had when I was working on this was the fact that there are so many underlying and underpinning nuances with these works progress administration interviews. There are all kinds of motivating factors that the interviewees would have to alter their stories, and so it was really interesting to see how some of them kind of catered based on their I think their willingness to want to please the predominantly white people who were conducting the interviews. But then there were also enslaved people who used it as an opportunity to kind of state their piece and be like, hey, like, this was wrong, and they treated us terribly. And there was one in particular that she was saying that they treated the color, and one of the quotes that I loved the most is she said that they treated colored folks like animals and would not hesitate to sell and separate them, yet they seemed to think they had souls and tried to make Christians of them, and stated that enslavers tried to make us believe that we couldn't care for ourselves if we weren't free, or if we were free.
Mhm.
And so the actions of, like, separating enslaved people and restricting them from learning to read and write, show this conscious understanding of racial difference that they had. And I thought it was really interesting how so many of them were, brave enough to kind of bring that forward, because, that was that was probably a rather intimidating situation for them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you teased it out very well and it really helped add to your narrative. So good
Oh,
job.
thank you.
And so shifting gears a little bit, what role do you see history and historical training playing in our society?
You know, one of the reasons I am so passionate about enslavement and the way that it was justified is due to the recent political resurgence in espousing paternalistic justifications for slavery. And so, when I heard about things like in Florida supporting new educational language surrounding slavery and, asserting that enslaved people developed these skills that could be applied for personal benefit, quote unquote. And so this resurgence of this paternalistic language, it kind of like made my stomach turn because to me, these issues, surrounding misconceptions of race are beyond partisan politics, and racism should be addressed no matter what side of the political spectrum someone is on. And so I want to do, meaningful work that helps educate people on the dangers of perpetuating paternalistic ideology and the practices' evocative effects on those who were enslaved and their descendants. And these quotes that I put in my paper, I hope that people, in different parts of the country kind of take this and run with it and be like, hey, here are direct quotes from people's experiences who have been enslaved, and their experiences affected them psychologically and physically for the rest of their lives. And that's not something that we can just wash away with, oh, well, they got some benefits from being slaves because really they didn't get benefits from being enslaved. They were kept in bondage and had zero rights. And so this idea that these people were psychologically abused through experiences in, the antebellum church as well, it's abhorrently dehumanizing. And so it's really, really important to me that teachers have the tools that they need, and maybe not to be extremely politically divisive in the classroom, but at least give voice to these people who have been enslaved, and create understanding about how enslavement is very real in its effects on society today, and how those effects are not something that we need to just sweep under the rug, or that we need to decide that the enslaved experience was any less severe than it was. And I know that's a hard line to toe, being a teacher and in education. But as far as history goes, I think it's really important that we don't forget those things.
Yeah, I think, history for me is always about contextualizing our present. So I can always figure out kind of, okay, how did we get here? What happened? What have we been through something like this before? And
Yeah.
then giving voice to the voiceless, which I think we've been doing as a profession a much better job in the last 30 to 40 years than, the first couple of centuries of the historic profession. So I appreciate when you're talking about, you know, kind of providing the totality of the story of the past, right? That's the most important. Just so arming people with all the facts. It's not a judgment. It's just this is what happened.
Exactly, exactly. And it's also really important to understand, and not that obviously nothing justifies enslavement, but when you're coming from a teaching standpoint and you're trying to explain to students that, yeah, these people, this was their livelihood. And although enslavement was absolutely wrong, you can also come at from it, from an angle of, hey, they it's not to necessarily justify their behavior again, but it is to help create an understanding of why it was so difficult for them to let go of that livelihood, and why they created this cognitive dissonance where they were justifying slavery because they didn't want to let go of their livelihood, but they also were doing something that was inherently very wrong.
Right.
And you can hold those things in the same hand, and as a human we can also understand, the fear that comes with letting go of enslavement as well, even though it's clearly not justified. And I think that's one of the things that's missing in historical education as well, is just trying to kind of ride that. It's trying to hold those two things as truths at the same time. Kind of this like post structuralist idea of, of multiple things can be true, and it doesn't mean that they're justified. but humans are real, and we get scared when we think that our resources are taken away from us, and or that they're threatened and our ways of life are threatened. We don't deal with change well. And gosh, I'm glad that we decided to finally get away from the model of enslavement, but we're still struggling with fighting over resources and autonomy and things like that. Even though it's better than it was, clearly, it's a very human thing to be afraid of change and livelihood. So I think just kind of shedding a light on those emotions on both sides of the spectrum kind of help balance that out a little bit.
Yes, well put. And I always say, historians are contextualizers. They give us the context, and then
Yes.
we can kind of infer whatever more moral judgments we have, but they're really there to kind of tell us how we got there. So,
Yes. Yeah.
and so we connected over social media as we both recently completed our graduate training, where we read a lot of books. So, what was one book that really resonated with you the most during your program?
I would have to say I gave this a lot of thought before I got on here. Because yes, we have read a lot, and there have been so many, gosh, books that have created a foundational understanding about history that are near and dear to my heart. But I would say probably Kidada E. Williams' book, I Saw Death Coming. I don't know if you are familiar with that book. But she utilizes testimonies from Black Americans who were tortured and lynched and driven from their home after the war's culmination. And she convincingly argued that the attempt at radical reconstruction
Mm.
and the fight for rights of Black Americans after the Civil War kind of signified this continuation of the war in the private sector. And so, one of her chapters, the chapter A Revolution in Reverse, is probably one of the most moving and accurate descriptions of failed Reconstruction that I've ever read. And she does such an excellent job of interweaving primary sources and these stories that are honestly very difficult to read and get through, but very, very necessary to illuminate, because people do not, and people forget. Historical memory erases a lot of the intensity of these experiences that Black Americans had, especially in the South. And she beautifully just amalgamates all of these stories, and then argues that this was just a continuation of the war in the private sector. And field reconstruction really, did affect, these formerly enslaved people and then generations coming, which kind of, and again, then connects to my research and the reason I'm doing what I'm doing. So I think that was probably the most formative book in my deciding what I wanted to research and what I felt was important to give voice to.
Yeah, it's on my to be read pile. In fact, I can see it right from my desk.
Yeah. It took me a while. It took me a while to get through it because it was very emotionally
Mm,
taxing, and yeah, I'm a very empathetic person, and so it was hearing stories, especially from children's points of view, when
mm.
they would experience these horrific events, like their parents being taken out and tortured, killed, and those things are awful to read, but they're very necessary when keeping that historical memory alive,
Mm.
and in giving historians a purpose for what we do, and remembering what we are giving these people a voice, and in a way giving them some sort of restitution by helping tell their story. And I think that is an amazing opportunity that we have as historians, like I said, to with our scholarship, and then also in the classroom.
Your description of Dr. Williams' book is very reminiscent to me for Carol Elkins, and she wrote The Legacy of Violence, and it's
Okay.
all about the British Empire's kind of pervasive and government sponsored and coordinated violence in order to kind of maintain empire. Uh,
Yeah.
Also pretty hard to get through. I mean, it's a beast of a book. It's like 600 some odd pages. Very well, obviously, researched, but your description kind of resonated with me.
Was she coming from an imperialist standpoint, or like?
Yeah, so she was really interrogating. So apparently, as a historian, she'd also testified. I think there was some investigations happening in the UK, and she had kind of testified about some genocide that I believe it was in one of the African nations, they were bringing suit against the British government to say,
Yeah.
"Hey, you committed this genocide," and she actually was a person who testified in the hearings, and then because she had to do all this research for that bit of testimony, it kind of opened up her questions on a larger scale of like,
Right.
okay, well, what does this look like kind of in its totality? And it's rough to get through.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. And I've always found it's quite interesting that, that in the UK that, the British were the first they came before us as far as abolition goes. And, in the 1830s, they had already abolished slavery, but then, oh, we're going to abolish slavery, but then we're also going to do all of this awful imperialistic genocide. And yeah, that's always been really fascinating to me how, again, that kind of cognitive dissonance comes up in history over and over again, where certain things are okay in one realm or sphere, and then in another, we can justify, this violent behavior to achieve our means in a different way.
Yes.
So yeah, it's really, really interesting. Humans are something else.
It makes history always a fascinating subject as far as I'm
Oh,
concerned.
absolutely. Yeah. There's always something to study and always behaviors that, that don't make sense, that are, there for us to kind of piece together and take apart and put together again. And
Yes, and try to figure out the motivations, right?
oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you've graduated and hopefully you've had some time to sleep now. Although with three boys, I don't know how much sleep you're getting, but what's
I don't
next?
know that they're bigger. When they were small, not so much.
So good. I'm glad you've had some time to sleep. So what's next for you?
I will be teaching post-Reconstruction United States history at Missouri State University and at our local Ozarks Technical Community College. I'm used to saying OTC because that's what we call it here. But yeah, so over here at MSU and OTC, I will be trying to slog my way through post-Reconstruction U.S. history. Yeah, and I'm really, really excited to have the opportunity. I'm nervous, almost as nervous as I was to be on this podcast. But I love teaching. That's been one of my favorite things about being graduate assistant. So
Wonderful. Well, I'm excited for your students. I'm envious of your students. I'm sure they're going to learn quite a bit. So, and where can people find you if they want to connect and learn more about you?
if they have any questions, my email is kessinger1676 at missouristate.edu. Anyone is welcome to contact me with any questions they might have. I'm fairly active on social media. My handle is Rock the Kespa. So it's ROCKTHKESSB as in boy AH. Yeah, the Clash. I kind of ripped it on my name there a little bit. Yeah, so for most sites, that's my handle. And yeah, you're welcome to follow along my Instagram or public posts. Obviously, all opinions are my own. Sometimes there's strong opinions. So
all right. Well, to my listeners out there, be sure to check out Kristin on your corner of the internet. She is an enthusiastic scholar and educator, and I can't wait to see what she does next. Thank you, Kristin.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Thanks so much for coming on. And there you have it, friends. Thanks again to Kristin for coming on and sharing your scholarship with me. Be sure to come back next Wednesday for yet another bonus episode. And of course, I'll see you Saturday. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.